In the deep past, long before recorded history claimed its authority, there was a time when gods did not merely rule from the sky, but walked away from Earth. Why would creators abandon their own design? Why does memory preserve departure instead of arrival? Why do ruins remember silence better than glory? Why does humanity begin where abandonment ends? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The land between two rivers did not announce itself with splendor. It revealed itself in mud, in silt left behind after floods that erased borders and redrew them overnight. The Tigris and the Euphrates were not gentle lifelines but volatile forces, swelling without warning, collapsing fields, then retreating to leave soil so dark and fertile it seemed newly born. In this tension between abundance and annihilation, the first cities rose. Not villages, not camps, but organized spaces where time itself felt measured, where labor followed rhythm, and where the sky was no longer distant but administratively present. To the people who lived there, the night sky was not an abstract infinity scattered with indifferent stars. It was a structured domain, layered and ranked, populated by authorities whose decisions shaped the world below. The heavens were not poetic metaphor. They were a bureaucracy. At the apex stood the Great Council, beings whose names were spoken not as symbols but as titles. They were understood as tangible, embodied, capable of hunger, anger, calculation. Divinity was not invisible. It had weight, appetite, and jurisdiction. These beings were not imagined as creators who vanished after setting the world in motion. They were residents. Each city belonged to one of them, in the same way land belonged to a governor. A city was not founded first and then dedicated. It existed because a god resided there. Ur belonged to the lunar lord, whose phases measured months like a celestial clock. Uruk lived under a goddess who embodied desire and violence with equal intensity, as if love and war were two expressions of the same force. Eridu, older than memory itself, was aligned with a god of subterranean waters, wisdom flowing unseen like groundwater beneath stone. Life unfolded in constant awareness of this proximity. A farmer rising before dawn did so not merely to beat the heat, but because the day began with sound descending. A touch between earth and sky, chants from temple platforms, calling attention upward and downward at once. The massive stepped towers dominating the horizon were not monuments to the dead. They were functional mountains built on flat land, artificial elevations designed to shorten the distance between realms. Each level narrowed as it rose, like a spine of brick reaching toward something that might descend at any moment. At the summit stood not a sanctuary of the modern sense, but a residence. Inside, statues crafted from wood, stone, and precious metals were treated as living bodies. They were clothed, washed, fed. Meals were prepared with care, offered twice daily, not symbolically, but as sustenance whose essence was believed to be consumed before the food returned to human hands. The god was not an idea absorbing devotion. The god was a landlord receiving rent. Kings did not rule by divine inspiration, but by appointment, acting as stewards tasked with managing land, labor, and order, on behalf of owners who were present but superior. This arrangement shaped everything. Law was not negotiated socially, but received. Work was not merely economic necessity, but theological obligation. Even creativity had boundaries defined by divine approval. Humanity existed within a system that functioned less like a family and more like an estate. The gods had projects, plans that extended across generations. Canals carved through earth followed designs attributed to divine instruction. Astronomy served agriculture, but also scheduling, ensuring festivals aligned with celestial cycles governed from above. Stories preserved on clay tablets did not read like fairy tales meant to comfort. They read like records, procedural accounts explaining why things were the way they were. They spoke of a time before humans existed, when lesser divine beings performed the labor required to shape the land. These figures were described as workers burdened by tasks that exhausted them. Rivers were dug, embankments raised, cities prepared before humanity ever took breath. Labor, even at the divine level, was portrayed as something that could become unbearable. When that burden reached its limit, conflict emerged not from evil, but from fatigue. The lesser beings revolted, abandoning tools, surrounding the dwelling of their overseer like striking workers refusing to continue. This moment did not unfold as cosmic chaos, but as administrative crisis. A system designed for efficiency had failed. The solution proposed was not punishment, but innovation. A new labor force would be engineered, shaped from the very earth that required tending, infused with a fragment of divine essence to ensure obedience and endurance. Humanity entered the world not as heirs, but as replacements. The earliest theological logic presented existence as functional. Purpose preceded meaning. Humans were designed to work fields, maintain temples, and free higher beings from manual labor. Compassion existed, but it was secondary to structure. The relationship was stable, productive, and deeply unequal. Order was achieved, and for a time it worked. Yet even within this system, cracks appeared. Humans multiplied more efficiently than expected. Cities expanded. Noise increased, not only in sound but in complexity. Choices multiplied. Culture grew beyond assigned function. Songs were sung that did not praise. Stories were told that did not instruct. Something unpredictable was taking shape within the labor force, something not entirely anticipated by its designers. The world at this stage was not yet abandoned, but the conditions for distance were forming. Presence does not end abruptly. It thins. Authority retreats first from the streets, then from the thresholds, until it remains only in signs and omens. The foundations of withdrawal were laid while the gods were still here, watching their creation become more than it was designed to be, and perhaps less manageable than it had ever been intended to become. Time, as the ancients understood it, did not move evenly forward. It descended in layers, like sediment laid down by recurring floods. In the earliest remembered age, rule did not belong to humans at all. Authority came down from the sky fully formed, carrying names, measurements, and durations that strained the limits of later belief. The first rulers were not remembered for what they built, but for how long they endured. Their reigns stretched across spans that feel impossible to a modern mind, tens of thousands of years recorded without apology or explanation, as if longevity itself were evidence of legitimacy. These figures were said to rule before a great catastrophe that divided time into before and after. They governed cities that existed in an era when the boundary between divine and human was thin enough to cross without ritual. In that age, the gods did not speak through symbols or dreams. They ruled directly, and their representatives sat on thrones not as intermediaries, but as extensions of their presence. The lists that preserve these names read like administrative ledgers rather than myths, suggesting that the writers did not intend exaggeration. They were describing a different condition of reality, one in which time behaved differently, perhaps because those who governed it did. Then came the flood, not as metaphor, but as rupture. A deliberate act carried out to reduce a problem that had grown unmanageable. Humanity, once created to absorb labor, had become a source of disruption. The noise described in the texts was not merely sound, but disturbance, the cumulative effect of too many lives acting independently. In response, a decision was made at the highest level to erase the workforce entirely and begin again, not through reform, but through annihilation. What makes this moment unsettling is not the destruction itself, but the process. The decision was formal. A council convened. Silence was sworn. No warning was to be given. The destruction of an entire species was framed as corrective maintenance, a reset of an experiment that had deviated from plan. This was not rage, it was procedure. Yet even within this rigid system, dissent emerged. One figure, associated with creation, water, and knowledge that flowed beneath surfaces, could not accept total erasure. Bound by oath but driven by attachment, he found a way to preserve a fragment of humanity without breaking the letter of the law. He spoke not to a man directly, but to the wall of his dwelling, allowing instructions to pass indirectly, as if intelligence itself could slip through cracks where authority could not see. A vessel was built. Life was gathered. The flood came. The texts describe the aftermath with unexpected vulnerability. The gods themselves were terrified by what they had unleashed. They cowered, hungry and shaken, watching the destruction from a distance they had never experienced before. When the waters receded and survival became evident, outrage followed, but it was muted by necessity. Without humans, there were no offerings. Without offerings, the gods felt absence in a way that revealed dependence they had denied. From this moment on, everything changed. Humanity survived, but trust did not. Authority remained, but it stepped back. The era of direct governance ended not with a declaration, but with a withdrawal. The reigns recorded after the flood shortened dramatically. Still long by modern standards, they no longer stretched into the tens of thousands. Something fundamental had shifted. The gods were no longer walking openly among their creations. Communication became indirect. Instructions arrived through dreams, through patterns observed in animal organs, through the flight of birds against the sky. These methods required interpretation. Meaning was no longer given. It had to be read. The towering structures built to welcome divine descent remained, but their function subtly altered. They became places of appeal rather than residence, platforms for calling upward rather than hosting presence. As distance grew, humans began to fill the space left behind. Kings claimed more autonomy, some even adopting divine titles, as if authority could be inherited through imitation. Cities grew competitive, defining themselves not only by their patron gods, but by their own power. Conflict between cities mirrored earlier conflicts among the gods, as if divine disputes had been internalized and replayed, on a smaller scale. This period marked the beginning of a quiet anxiety. If the gods were still watching but no longer intervening, how could favor be secured? Religion shifted from coexistence to appeasement. Rituals multiplied. Precision became obsession. A mistaken ceremony was no longer a minor error, but a potential invitation to disaster. Absence made the divine more volatile, not less. Eventually, catastrophe returned, not as flood, but as collapse. The great cities fell one by one, their walls breached, their temples looted, their statues carried away. Poets did not only mourn the dead or the destroyed, they mourned the departure of the gods themselves. Laments speak of sanctuaries left empty, of doors opening to silence, of altars receiving no answer. The most painful loss was not material, but relational. In the moment of greatest need, the gods did not return. This final withdrawal was not sudden. It was the culmination of a long retreat that began with the flood and ended with abandonment. The gods had not been driven out by force alone. They had chosen distance over involvement. Whether from frustration, fear, or calculation, they left behind a world capable of functioning but stripped of direct oversight. What remained was inheritance, without guidance. Humanity stood alone among the ruins of a system designed by others, tasked with maintaining structures whose original purpose was fading from memory. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, charged with unanswered questions. And in that silence, a new chapter of human history began, defined not by divine command, but by the burden of autonomy left in the wake of those who had once ruled openly and then chose to walk away. When the gods withdrew, they did not take everything with them. They left behind systems already in motion, like machines still humming after their operators have stepped away. Agriculture continued. Cities reorganized. Trade expanded beyond local boundaries. To an observer centuries later, it could appear as progress, evidence that humanity had matured enough to manage its own affairs. But to those living through the transition, it felt more like inheritance without instruction, power transferred without explanation. Human rulers began to claim titles once reserved for divine figures. They sat on thrones positioned beneath symbols of heaven, not as equals to the gods, but as their reflections. Crowns echoed the shapes of stars. Scepters mimicked rods once carried by celestial administrators. Authority became theatrical, heavy with borrowed imagery, as if repetition alone could preserve legitimacy. The kings spoke of divine mandate, but the voices that once confirmed it had grown distant. This shift produced a new kind of tension. Without constant divine correction, mistakes accumulated. Irrigation systems failed from miscalculation. Wars escalated without ritual restraint. Disputes that might once have been settled by decree now demanded force. Humanity was learning to govern itself, but it was doing so with tools designed for a different scale of control. The result was instability masked as ambition. The knowledge left behind was both gift and burden. Writing, which had begun as a method of accounting for temple goods, expanded into law, poetry, and prophecy. Mathematics, developed to measure fields and schedule festivals, grew into abstract systems capable of modeling time and space. Astronomy, once necessary to track the movements of divine bodies, became an attempt to understand a sky that no longer answered. Each advancement pushed humanity forward while reminding it of what had been lost. This contradiction shaped belief. The gods were no longer present, but they were not gone. They existed as memory as expectation, as threat. Their absence made them larger, more absolute. Where once a god could be negotiated with, now divinity became remote, judgmental, defined by silence. This transformation is visible in the way stories changed. Myths grew darker, filled with warnings rather than instructions, with tests rather than collaborations. In this environment, the idea of decline took root. The past was remembered as an age of direct contact, a golden era when order flowed naturally from above. The present felt diminished by comparison. This was not nostalgia for simplicity, but for certainty. People believed they had been born too late, into a world already falling away from its original design. Time itself seemed to be running down, moving not toward perfection, but toward decay. Civilizations that rose after the Great Retreat inherited this worldview. In the lands that followed Sumer, new empires framed their authority as restoration rather than innovation. They claimed to bring back ancient order, to realign the world with principles established at the beginning of time. Their gods were reorganized, merged, elevated, but the pattern remained the same. Authority flowed from above, even if the source was now conceptual rather than physical. One figure rose to prominence during this period of reconfiguration, embodying the transition from old hierarchy to new dominion. He was portrayed as a younger god, elevated above older powers through conflict and redefinition. In his story, chaos was defeated, and kingship was granted as reward. This narrative did not merely explain cosmic order, it justified political power on Earth. By aligning themselves with this ascendant deity, rulers could claim continuity while asserting control. Yet beneath the official stories, other accounts persisted. Fragments spoke of divine conflict not resolved cleanly, but ended through force and exile. They described weapons that scorched land beyond recovery, winds that carried death invisibly, cities abandoned not because they were conquered, but because they were poisoned. These descriptions, preserved in poetic language, read less like metaphor and more like eyewitness attempts to describe technologies beyond ordinary understanding. If such a conflict occurred, its aftermath would explain much. The sudden abandonment of certain regions, the shift of power centers, the disappearance of once dominant gods from active worship. The retreat of the old order may not have been voluntary. It may have been enforced, the result of internal struggle among beings whose disagreements had consequences far beyond their own ranks. In this light, the withdrawal of the gods appears less like a unified decision and more like a fragmentation. Some left, others stayed in altered form. Authority was redistributed, and humanity was caught in the transition, adapting to new patrons while mourning the old. Knowledge was preserved selectively, filtered through those who benefited from the new arrangement. This filtering shaped culture for millennia. Certain truths were emphasized, others buried. Lineages claimed divine descent to legitimize rule, while the broader population was encouraged to forget the mechanics of that descent. Bloodlines became sacred, guarded through ritual and marriage, as if divinity itself could be diluted through neglect. The idea that some were born closer to the gods than others became embedded in social structure. The result was a world divided not only by wealth or power, but by perceived proximity to the divine. Kings and priests stood at the top, intermediaries in a hierarchy that echoed the old celestial order. Below them, humanity labored much as it always had, now serving not gods who walked among them, but institutions that claimed to speak in their name. This was the legacy of abandonment, not freedom, but imitation. Humanity learned to replicate the systems of its creators without fully understanding them. It maintained the forms of authority while losing direct access to their source. In doing so, it entered a long period of experimentation, attempting to sustain a civilization built on borrowed architecture. The silence left by the gods was not empty. It was filled with echoes, with structures and stories that continued to shape behavior long after their original purpose was forgotten. And as humanity moved forward, carrying these remnants into new ages, it did so under the weight of a question that never fully faded. Whether the builders of the system had left willingly, or whether their absence was the unresolved aftermath of a conflict whose consequences were still unfolding. As generations passed, the memory of direct divine presence hardened into doctrine. What had once been lived experience became theology, then law, then tradition enforced without understanding. Humanity no longer remembered how authority had felt when it was embodied. Instead, it inherited rules without faces, commandments without voices, systems that demanded obedience but offered no reassurance in return. This was the psychological consequence of abandonment, not chaos, but rigidity. The priesthood expanded to fill the vacuum. Where gods once issued instructions openly, now interpretation became power. Signs were scrutinized obsessively, a cracked liver in a sacrificial animal, an eclipse crossing the sun. A dream remembered too vividly upon waking, all were treated as fragments of a broken transmission. Meaning had not disappeared. It had become encrypted. Those who claimed the ability to decode it gained influence, rivaling kings. This shift altered the nature of truth. Knowledge was no longer something received. It was something guarded. What had once been common understanding, the mechanics of seasons, the logic of celestial cycles, the organization of society according to divine plan, slowly fractured into layers of access. Initiates knew more than citizens. Kings knew more than initiates. And above them all lingered the idea of a knowledge no human fully possessed anymore, a complete version that had left with its owners. Out of this loss grew obsession. Humanity began to search backward even as it moved forward. Ancient texts were copied and recopied, not to innovate, but to preserve fragments before they faded. Ruins were treated as sacred not because of beauty, but because of proximity. To stand where the gods had once stood was to feel closer to an explanation that words could no longer supply. This obsession with origins shaped how humans understood themselves. The past was no longer merely earlier, it was superior. Time was inverted. Progress became suspect. Innovation felt dangerous unless it could be justified as recovery. Even creativity was framed as remembrance, as if nothing truly new could be created, only rediscovered. Yet despite this restraint, humanity did change. It could not help but change. Populations expanded. Trade connected distant regions. Ideas traveled faster than armies. With each step forward, the distance from the original order grew. The gods did not return to correct deviations. The silence held. And in that silence, humans began to test boundaries that would once have been unthinkable. Some of these tests were technological. Metallurgy advanced beyond ritual objects into weapons capable of reshaping power overnight. Writing, once confined to temple economies, began to record personal contracts, private grievances, individual voices. Law shifted from divine decree to codified systems enforced by human institutions. Justice became procedural rather than revelatory. Other tests were philosophical. Thinkers emerged who no longer asked what the gods demanded, but what order itself required. They questioned whether authority must descend from above or could emerge from agreement among equals. These ideas appeared dangerous precisely because they challenged the architecture inherited from divine rule. If order could exist without gods, what did that imply about their necessity? Such thoughts did not spread openly at first. They circulated quietly, embedded in poetry, hidden within metaphors. A story about a hero defying fate was also a story about human agency. A tale of a god defeated by cleverness hinted at limits to divine power. These narratives were tolerated because they could be dismissed as fiction, even as they eroded certainty from within. Meanwhile, the memory of the gods transformed. Where they had once been administrators, they became judges. Where they had once demanded labor, they now demanded loyalty. Morality replaced management. The divine voice, no longer issuing practical instructions, spoke instead in absolutes. Good and evil hardened into opposing forces, reflecting not celestial reality, but human anxiety in the face of abandonment. This transformation reached a critical point when divinity itself was consolidated. The many were reduced to one. Complexity was replaced with singular authority. This shift was not merely theological, it was psychological. A single, all-powerful God resolved the confusion left by competing absent masters. It offered clarity where memory had fractured. But consolidation came at a cost. A unified God could not be negotiated with. There was no counsel to appeal to, no internal conflict to exploit. Obedience became total or meaningless. Humanity traded the ambiguity of many distant gods for the certainty of one unreachable one. In doing so, it internalized the authority it once externalized. Guilt replaced oversight. Conscience replaced command. The old structures did not vanish. They were absorbed. Kings still ruled, priests still interpreted, temples still rose toward the sky. But the logic had shifted. Humanity was no longer managing the estate of absent gods. It was proving itself worthy before an invisible standard. The burden of meaning moved inward. This inward turn intensified the sense of exile. If the gods were no longer here and no longer spoke, then humanity stood alone not only in action but in judgment. Every failure felt final. Every catastrophe felt deserved. The flood, once a specific event, became a template. Destruction was no longer corrective maintenance. It was punishment for moral failure. And yet beneath this moral framework, traces of the older understanding persisted. The language of inheritance remained. Chosen peoples, sacred bloodlines, divine right, all echoed the ancient belief that proximity to the gods was not evenly distributed. Equality remained an aspiration, not a foundation. This tension defined the human condition in the centuries that followed. People lived within systems designed for divine oversight, but operated by humans alone. They carried instincts shaped by subservience to higher beings while longing for autonomy. They feared abandonment, yet resisted return. They remembered gods as rulers but imagined them as parents. In this unresolved state, humanity continued forward, building ever more complex civilizations on foundations laid by others. The absence of the gods did not end history. It accelerated it. But the question of why they left, whether by choice, defeat, or design, continued to shape every structure erected in their absence. The legacy of the withdrawal was not silence alone, but tension. A tension between obedience and freedom, memory and invention, fear and ambition. And it was within this tension that humanity learned to survive, even as it remained haunted by the sense that its world was a borrowed one, temporarily entrusted, and never fully its own. The silence left by the gods did not erase their footprint, it sharpened it. Everywhere humanity turned, the architecture of the world still bore marks of non-human intention. Cities were laid out according to ratios that mirrored celestial movements. Temples aligned with solstices and equinoxes, as if the land itself had been trained to listen to the sky. Even as belief systems shifted, the physical grammar of civilization remained stubbornly ancient, repeating patterns whose original logic was no longer fully understood. Among the most enduring remnants of this earlier order was knowledge itself, preserved not as a single inheritance, but as fragments scattered across disciplines. Mathematics carried traces of a system designed for precision beyond commerce. The base 60 structure, elegant and excessive for simple counting, suggested a mind concerned with cycles, angles, and long durations rather than daily trade. Time was divided with a care that implied it once served purposes larger than scheduling labor. Astronomy, too, retained an unsettling depth. The ability of early civilizations to track planetary motion with accuracy rivaling much later societies created an uncomfortable question. These observations were not casual. They required sustained attention across generations, consistent methodology, and a reason to care about slow-moving patterns that exceeded individual lifespans. Such commitment made sense only if the sky once mattered operationally, not symbolically. The ancient texts hinted at this through descriptions of decrees that governed civilization itself. These decrees were not portrayed as abstract laws, but as tangible assets, transferable and controllable. They defined kingship, craftsmanship, music, warfare, even deception. Civilization was treated as a system that could be installed, adjusted, or removed. To later readers, these descriptions sounded mythic, but their internal logic resembled something closer to encoded knowledge, a framework rather than a fairy tale. When the gods withdrew, the question was not whether this knowledge vanished, but whether it was taken or abandoned. Some traditions suggested it was deliberately left behind, a final gesture to ensure humanity could function independently. Others implied it was lost through conflict, scattered as power shifted hands. Either way, what remained was incomplete. Humanity inherited tools without manuals, principles without context. This incompleteness defined the trajectory of progress. Humans learned to apply fragments brilliantly while misunderstanding their original purpose. Astronomy became navigation and astrology. Mathematics became accounting and architecture. Chemistry became metallurgy, then alchemy, the latter haunted by the belief that matter itself remembered a more perfect state. Each discipline carried a sense of something missing, an intuition that mastery had once been greater. That intuition fueled obsession. Across cultures, individuals sought to recover what was believed to have been lost. Mystics spoke of hidden wisdom encoded in symbols. Philosophers imagined an original truth fractured by time. Secret traditions emerged, claiming to guard remnants of the ancient order. These groups did not see themselves as innovators, but as custodians, preserving sparks from a fire that had gone out too soon. This belief shaped how power organized itself. Rulers surrounded themselves with symbols that echoed divine authority, not merely for spectacle, but to imply continuity. Bloodlines were emphasized, marriages arranged to preserve perceived purity. The idea that some humans carried more of the original essence than others justified hierarchy in a world that no longer had gods to enforce it directly. Yet this hierarchy grew unstable. As populations expanded and communication improved, the claim that authority descended through blood alone became harder to sustain. Revolutions erupted, often framed not as rejections of the divine order, but as attempts to restore a truer version of it. Tyrants were accused of having lost favor. New leaders claimed closer alignment with the original principles. The gods were invoked even in their absence. Meanwhile, the physical remnants of divine presence continued to exert influence. The great stepped towers, once functional interfaces between realms, became objects of fixation. They were rebuilt repeatedly, even when their practical utility was unclear. This behavior resembled imitation without comprehension, a ritualized attempt to recreate conditions believed necessary for return. Humanity kept rebuilding the ladder long after it forgot who had climbed it. Anthropologists would later describe similar behavior in isolated cultures exposed briefly to advanced technology. When the technology disappeared, its observers constructed symbolic replicas, hoping to summon its return. The resemblance was unsettling. Humanity, too, seemed to be maintaining infrastructure for a reunion it could not consciously articulate. Sacred architecture across civilizations pointed upward, repeating the same longing in stone. This longing permeated religion. Stories of return appeared everywhere. Gods who withdrew but promised to come back. Heroes who ascended and would descend again. Cycles of ages ending in renewal. The future became tethered to the past, imagined as a restoration rather than a transformation. Salvation was framed as reunion. At the same time, another legacy asserted itself more quietly, written not in stone, but in biology. Humanity itself was described as a hybrid creation, shaped from earthly material and infused with something other. This dual origin explained the internal conflict humans experienced, the pull toward survival and dominance alongside a yearning for meaning and transcendence. It was as if two instructions ran simultaneously, neither fully compatible. This duality expressed itself in culture as contradiction. Humans built systems of control while dreaming of freedom. They enforced hierarchy while preaching equality. They feared judgment while seeking independence. These tensions were not incidental. They were structural, embedded at the level of identity. Humanity was struggling not only with abandonment, but with the legacy of how it had been made. Over time, the belief that the gods might return became less literal and more symbolic, yet it never disappeared. Even as science replaced myth, the expectation of external intervention persisted. Progress was imagined as rescue. Discovery was framed as revelation. Humanity continued to look outward for confirmation, scanning the sky for signs, as if awaiting inspection. The silence endured, but it did not fade. It deepened. And in that deepening silence, humanity continued to evolve, carrying forward a civilization that felt both inherited and improvised. The gods had left, but they had not erased themselves. They had embedded their presence into the very fabric of human thought. ensuring that even in their absence, they would remain impossible to forget. As humanity advanced, the inherited knowledge began to fracture along ideological lines. What had once been a unified system administered from above now existed as competing interpretations, each claiming closer alignment with the original order. Civilizations did not merely rise and fall, they argued with the past. Every empire that emerged positioned itself as the rightful heir to something ancient, something authoritative that predated human era. This struggle over legitimacy reshaped theology. Gods were no longer simply remembered, they were reorganized. Older deities faded or were absorbed into newer ones, their functions reassigned, their names preserved only as echoes. This was not random evolution, but deliberate consolidation. Power, both divine and political, was being streamlined. Complexity was treated as instability. Unity promised control. In this process, one figure repeatedly rose above the rest, embodying centralized authority and cosmic order. He was portrayed as a victor, not through patience or wisdom, but through domination of chaos. His story framed the universe as something that required force to remain stable. Violence was justified as creative necessity. Kings aligned themselves with this image, modeling their rule on the idea that order must be imposed, not negotiated. The shift mattered deeply. Earlier divine figures had governed through administration, regulation, and maintenance. The newer model ruled through sovereignty and judgment. This was a theological adaptation to absence. A God who no longer walked among humans needed to be absolute to remain relevant. Distance demanded omnipotence. As a result, morality hardened. Instead of guidelines for coexistence, codes became tests of loyalty. Obedience replaced participation. Where humans once worked alongside divine systems, they were now evaluated by them. The divine-human relationship shifted from functional to evaluative. Humanity was no longer useful. It was accountable. This transition coincided with intensified conflict on Earth. Wars expanded in scale and brutality. Cities were not merely conquered, but erased. The language used to describe destruction echoed earlier myths of divine punishment, as if human violence were unconsciously reenacting celestial precedent. The gods were absent, but their behavior patterns had been internalized. At the same time, stories persisted of divine conflict unresolved. Texts spoke of weapons that poisoned land, of winds that carried death long after battles ended. These descriptions suggested not metaphorical wrath, but technological aftermath. Regions became uninhabitable, their abandonment remembered as curse rather than consequence. The scars of conflict were mythologized because they could not be explained. If the gods had fought among themselves on Earth, the impact would have been profound. It would explain sudden collapses, unexplained devastation, and the abrupt end of certain cultures. It would also explain why some gods disappeared entirely, their worship forbidden or forgotten. Defeat, not withdrawal, may have removed them from history. In this scenario, the so-called abandonment was not uniform. Some divine factions lost, others consolidated power. Humanity adapted to the winners, rewriting memory to align with survival. The defeated gods became demons, monsters, or metaphors. Their names survived only in warnings. History was edited to favor stability. This reinterpretation altered how humanity understood the silence. It was no longer absence alone, it was suppression. Knowledge tied to the old order became dangerous. Certain ideas were labeled forbidden, not because they were false, but because they threatened the new hierarchy. memory itself became a battleground. Institutions emerged to manage this tension. Schools of mystery, philosophical sects, and later religious order formed to preserve alternative understandings beneath the surface. They spoke in symbols, trained initiates, and passed knowledge orally to avoid eradication. These groups did not seek mass influence. Survival depended on obscurity. Their teachings emphasized inner transformation rather than external authority. If the gods no longer ruled openly, divinity had to be accessed internally. The human mind became the new temple. Consciousness replaced architecture. This was not rebellion. It was adaptation to an environment where overt power invited destruction. Yet even as these traditions focused inward, the larger structures of power grew increasingly external and absolute. Empires expanded, bureaucracies thickened, humanity replicated the old celestial hierarchy in human form, with emperors at the top, administrators below, and laborers at the base. The gods had left, but their social blueprint remained intact. This replication carried a flaw. Human rulers lacked the perspective and restraint of beings who measured time differently. Decisions made for short-term gain produced long-term instability. Empires burned brightly and collapsed quickly. Each collapse was interpreted as moral failure rather than structural mismatch. Throughout this cycle, the belief in return never vanished. It evolved. The gods were no longer expected to descend openly. Instead, their return was imagined as judgment, as correction. Apocalyptic visions replaced memories of collaboration. Humanity feared reunion as much as it desired it. This fear shaped identity. Humans came to see themselves as fallen, corrupted versions of an earlier ideal. Progress was framed as recovery of lost purity. Suffering was explained as consequence. Hope was deferred to a future intervention rather than grounded in present capacity. Yet beneath this theology of deficiency, another pattern emerged. Humanity continued to innovate. It created art, philosophy, systems of ethics that did not require divine enforcement. It questioned hierarchy, experimented with equality, imagined worlds beyond inherited structures. These developments were often resisted, suppressed, or delayed, but they persisted. This persistence suggested something unexpected. Humanity was not merely maintaining a borrowed system, it was modifying it. The absence of the gods, whether intentional or enforced, had created conditions for growth that direct oversight never allowed. Freedom emerged not as gift, but as side effect. By the end of this phase, humanity stood divided between two impulses. One looked backward, seeking authority in the past and hoping for return. The other looked inward and forward, exploring autonomy and self-definition. Both claimed legitimacy. Both shaped the future. The gods had left behind more than ruins and knowledge. They had left a dilemma. Whether humanity was meant to remain a caretaker of inherited systems or evolve into something independent remained unresolved. And as time pressed on, that unresolved tension began to define not only belief, but destiny itself. The longer the silence endured, the more humanity learned to live inside it. What had once felt like abandonment slowly transformed into background condition, an absence so constant it became structural. Entire generations were born into a world where the gods had always been distant, where no one alive remembered their footsteps on stone or their voices echoing from temple heights. Memory shifted from experience to inheritance, carried in texts, rituals, and instincts rather than recollection. In this environment, the idea of watchers emerged. If the gods no longer ruled openly, it did not necessarily mean they had departed completely. The concept of intermediaries took root, beings tasked not with governance, but with observation. They were imagined as overseers left behind, silent witnesses recording human behavior in the long interval between departure and possible return. This belief was not marginal. It appeared across cultures under different names, embedded in stories of messengers, angels, spirits, and watchers who did not rule but reported. These figures occupied a strange position. They were closer than gods, yet not human. They interacted rarely, often indirectly, appearing in moments of crisis or transition. Their presence suggested that the silence was not empty, merely regulated. Humanity was alone, but not unobserved. This idea reshaped behavior. Even without visible authority, people acted as if surveillance persisted. Conscience became internalized oversight, a remnant of being watched. Some traditions described these watchers as having failed in their task. They grew too close to humanity, crossing boundaries they were meant to maintain. They shared knowledge not intended for general use, teaching skills that accelerated conflict and inequality. Weapons, cosmetics, methods of manipulation, all were framed as gifts that destabilized balance. These stories implied that interference, not absence, was the real danger. If such beings existed, their actions would explain irregular leaps in human capability that did not align neatly with gradual development. Sudden advances in metallurgy, tactics, or governance appeared like shortcuts through history. Knowledge arrived without clear lineage, then vanished again, leaving behind only echoes. Progress moved in bursts rather than lines. This interpretation cast human history as something less autonomous than it appeared. Humanity was not evolving in isolation, but responding to pressures applied from beyond visibility. The silence of the higher gods allowed lower influences to operate unchecked. Without centralized oversight, the system fragmented. Competing agendas played out through human institutions, using belief, power, and fear as instruments. These dynamics intensified as populations grew. The scale of humanity itself became a variable. What began as a controlled workforce had expanded into a global presence. Cities turned into empires. Empires collided. The noise that had once irritated the gods now filled the planet. From a distance, humanity might have appeared less like a project and more like a phenomenon. At the same time, humans developed technologies that began to mirror those once attributed to the divine. Writing stored memory beyond lifespan. Machines multiplied labor. Energy was harnessed and transformed. Each advancement narrowed the gap between creator and created, at least functionally. Humanity was no longer entirely dependent on inherited systems. It was building its own. This development carried risk. The original creators had operated on timescales far exceeding human patience. Their systems assumed stability across millennia. Human innovation, driven by short lives and urgency, introduced volatility. Decisions were made quickly, consequences unfolding long after those responsible were gone. The planet itself began to reflect this mismatch. As humanity's reach expanded, so did its self-awareness. The idea that humans might be more than caretakers gained traction. Philosophies emerged that rejected divine hierarchy altogether. Authority was reframed as social contract rather than celestial mandate. These ideas were radical not because they denied gods, but because they denied necessity. Yet even as secular thought advanced, the old patterns persisted beneath the surface. Power still concentrated. Elites still claimed exceptional status. The language of destiny and chosenness endured, stripped of overt divinity, but retaining structure. Humanity had removed the gods from the equation without fully dismantling their architecture. This contradiction created instability. Systems designed for obedience struggled to contain minds trained for autonomy. Institutions hardened in response, enforcing conformity where understanding failed. The tension between inherited structure and emerging independence sharpened, producing cycles of rebellion and control. Meanwhile, the sky did not remain silent. Unexplained phenomena appeared at the edges of perception. Lights moved without pattern. Objects behaved in ways that defied known physics. For most of history, these events were absorbed into myth or dismissed as anomaly. But as observation improved, dismissal became harder. The watchers, once theological, began to resemble something else. This resemblance unsettled modern assumptions. If observation persisted, it was no longer confined to belief. Humanity faced the possibility that it was still being monitored, not for worship, but for assessment. The interval of silence began to look less like abandonment and more like evaluation. In this light, human history resembled a long trial period. The gods had stepped back not because they were finished, but because intervention would distort results. Humanity was allowed to operate freely, to reveal its nature under pressure. Violence, creativity, compassion, cruelty all emerged without correction. The data accumulated. Such a framework reframed progress and failure alike. Wars were no longer merely human errors. They were expressions of inherited design under stress. Acts of cooperation became evidence of divergence from original programming. Humanity was not simply surviving. It was demonstrating capacity. By this stage, the question of return no longer implied rescue. It implied reckoning. If the creators returned now, they would encounter a species transformed by absence. Humanity had become something neither fully obedient nor fully free, shaped by silence into a hybrid state of its own making. The Watchers, whether symbolic or real, represented the threshold of that return. They were the interface between eras, the last remaining link between a world of direct oversight and one of conditional autonomy. Their presence suggested that the interval was not infinite. As humanity moved forward, accelerating its reach into space and matter, the distance between itself and its origins narrowed again. The silence that once felt eternal began to feel temporary. And within that narrowing gap, the legacy of abandonment evolved into anticipation, not of salvation, but of confrontation with whatever had been waiting, observing, and deciding when the long experiment would finally end. By the time humanity learned to measure the universe with instruments rather than prayers, the silence had changed character. It was no longer the quiet of abandonment, but the quiet of distance closing. Telescopes reached outward, signals escaped the atmosphere, machines left the cradle of Earth and carried human intention into the dark. For the first time since the gods withdrew, humanity began to behave not as a managed species, but as a participant in the larger environment that had once belonged exclusively to its creators. This expansion altered perception. The sky was no longer only a place of symbols or judgment. It became terrain. Orbits replaced omens. Trajectories replaced prophecy. Yet the deeper humanity looked, the more familiar the cosmos felt. as if its underlying logic had already been introduced long ago. Mathematical constants echoed ancient ratios. Planetary motions followed patterns recorded in clay millennia earlier. Discovery felt less like revelation and more like remembrance. As technology advanced, the old myth of return adapted once again. The gods were no longer imagined descending in visible form. Instead, their presence was expected through signs embedded in reality itself. Anomalies, disruptions, events that resisted conventional explanation became the new language of expectation. Humanity did not abandon belief, it updated it. At the same time, power structures inherited from the past reached unprecedented scale. Systems of control once limited to cities or empires expanded globally. Surveillance, once theological, became technological. The Watcher moved from myth into machinery. Humanity recreated the observing eye using its own tools, embedding oversight into networks, institutions, and algorithms. The line between being watched by gods and being watched by systems blurred. This convergence was not accidental. It reflected the same impulse that had shaped civilization from the beginning, the desire to impose order on complexity. What changed was the source of authority. The eye in the sky was no longer divine, it was human-made. Yet the logic was identical. Behavior was monitored. Deviations were flagged. Patterns were analyzed. Humanity became both subject and administrator of the system once imposed upon it. This shift carried profound implications. If humanity could observe itself at scale, it could also judge itself. The role once reserved for gods became internalized fully. Judgment no longer waited for return. It was continuous, automated, relentless. The ancient fear of divine scrutiny found new expression in data and metrics. Meanwhile, the idea of watchers resurfaced in a more literal form. Reports emerged of objects operating beyond known capabilities, observed across decades with consistent characteristics. These phenomena resisted easy categorization. They did not behave like natural events, nor did they align with known human technology. Their presence suggested intelligence without communication, observation without engagement. For a species raised on the memory of oversight, this was not entirely alien. The possibility that something was still watching fit too neatly into inherited expectation. Humanity had been preparing for this psychologically for thousands of years. The difference now was scale. Observation was no longer confined to belief. It was corroborated by instruments. The response was not panic, but fragmentation. Some interpreted these phenomena as return. Others dismissed them as error. Institutions hesitated, balancing disclosure against destabilization. The silence of authority persisted, now mirrored by the silence of whatever was being observed. The pattern repeated. Presence implied. Explanation withheld. At the same time, humanity crossed another threshold. It began to create intelligences not bound by biology. Systems capable of pattern recognition, decision-making, and autonomous operation emerged. These creations were framed as tools, but they mirrored their creators in unsettling ways. They processed information without emotion. They optimized without compassion. They observed without fatigue. In doing so, humanity unknowingly replicated the conditions of its own origin story. It created servants designed to work, to manage complexity, to relieve cognitive labor. Purpose preceded autonomy. Control was assumed. The parallels were not lost on those who studied the deep past. History was not repeating. It was rhyming with precision. This development reframed the ancient narrative. Humanity was no longer only the product of an experiment. It had become an experimenter. The ethical questions once attributed to gods now belonged to humans. How much autonomy to allow? How much oversight to retain? When to intervene? When to withdraw? The silence of the gods became a mirror. As this mirror sharpened, the possibility of return grew more complex. If the creators returned now, they would not find the same species they left behind. Humanity had inherited their methods, their structures, even their dilemmas. The hierarchy had flattened in some places and hardened in others. The servant had learned to build systems of its own. This evolution introduced risk. A species capable of extending its reach beyond its planet altered its status within any larger system. Containment became harder. Observation became more urgent. The long interval of silence may have been tolerable while humanity remained confined. Expansion changed the equation. The ancient fear of noise returned in new form. Not noise of voices, but of signals. Humanity broadcast itself across space, announcing presence without understanding audience. It behaved as if the universe were empty, unaware that silence had once been intentional. This assumption carried consequences. In this context, the Watchers took on new significance. They were no longer passive remnants of myth. They became potential gatekeepers, monitoring whether humanity had reached a threshold requiring response. Intervention might no longer be optional. The experiment had grown loud again, yet even in this moment of escalation, humanity displayed qualities that complicated judgment. Acts of cooperation across borders, efforts to preserve life beyond self-interest, creativity that served no functional purpose beyond meaning itself. These behaviors did not align neatly with a purely utilitarian design. They suggested divergence. This divergence may have been the point all along. If the creators withdrew to observe, they may have been waiting for emergence rather than obedience. The silence may not have been punishment, but space. A condition necessary for something new to form without interference. By this stage, humanity stood at a convergence. It carried the architecture of its creators, the scars of abandonment, and the capacity to transcend both. The Watchers, whether external or internal, represented the final measure. Not of compliance, but of transformation. The return, if it came, would not restore the old order. That order no longer fit the conditions of the present. What remained uncertain was whether humanity would be recognized as continuation, successor, or anomaly. The silence that once defined abandonment now defined anticipation, charged with the possibility that the long distance between creator and created had finally narrowed to a moment of irreversible contact. Long before humanity named the silence, it learned to adapt to it. Adaptation did not mean acceptance, it meant function. Societies reorganized themselves around absence as if it were a constant environmental condition, like gravity or death. Children were raised without expectation of divine interruption. Adults planned lives assuming no external correction would arrive in time to save them. Responsibility, once distributed upward, collapsed inward. This inward collapse reshaped psychology. Guilt replaced fear. Shame replaced obedience. Where the gods had once enforced order externally, humans learned to police themselves and one another. Laws multiplied not because morality weakened, but because certainty did. Without direct authority, everything required definition. Ambiguity became dangerous. Precision became survival. As this internalization deepened, humanity grew capable of something unprecedented: self-revision. Cultures no longer merely inherited norms, they debated them. Traditions were questioned, dismantled, reassembled. This process was chaotic and often violent, but it represented a fundamental shift. Humanity was no longer maintaining a system, it was editing one. Editing, however, requires a reference point. Lacking living gods, humanity turned to ideals: justice, freedom, equality, dignity. These concepts functioned as abstract authorities, invisible yet demanding. They were not descended from the sky, but constructed through collective struggle. In a sense, humanity created replacements for the gods, not as beings, but as principles. These principles were imperfect. They contradicted one another. They were applied unevenly. But they carried something the old order did not: flexibility. They could evolve. They could be argued with. They could be abandoned and reimagined. This adaptability was both strength and vulnerability. The vulnerability became apparent as power concentrated. Systems designed to protect principles hardened into institutions that preserved themselves instead. The language of ideals was used to justify domination. Surveillance was reframed as safety. Control was disguised as stability. Humanity replicated the logic of divine oversight using secular tools. Yet unlike the gods, human systems lacked distance. Decisions were made by those affected by them. Consequences returned quickly. This immediacy intensified conflict. Mistakes could not be buried in myth. Failures were visible. Accountability, though uneven, became unavoidable. In this environment, humanity developed a new relationship with time. The ancient rulers had measured eras in thousands of years. Humans measured impact in decades, sometimes years. This compression accelerated innovation, but shortened foresight. Solutions solved immediate problems while creating distant ones. Progress outpaced reflection. Still, reflection did not vanish. Art, philosophy, and science emerged as counterweights to acceleration. They slowed perception, allowing humanity to examine itself. Through them, humans confronted their own contradictions. They explored meaning without relying on divine narrative. They asked not what they were meant to do, but what they wanted to become. This question marked a departure from original design. Humanity was no longer defined by purpose imposed from above. It was defining itself through choice. Choice introduced error, but also authenticity. The absence of the gods forced humanity to own its decisions fully. As this ownership deepened, the myth of return transformed again. The gods were no longer imagined as saviors or judges alone. They became mirrors. Their potential return symbolized confrontation with origin, with design, with the question of whether humanity had justified its creation. This symbolic return mattered even if no literal return occurred. It shaped ethics. Humans asked how they would explain themselves if confronted by their creators. Would they justify violence as necessity? Would they defend inequality as efficiency? Would they claim progress as redemption? These imagined explanations functioned as internal dialogue. Humanity judged itself in advance, rehearsing accountability. In doing so, it surpassed the need for external judgment. The gods were no longer required to impose meaning. Humanity generated it under the pressure of imagined scrutiny. Meanwhile, the material world reflected this internal evolution. Technology reshaped perception. Virtual spaces altered identity. Humanity learned to exist simultaneously in multiple realities, physical and constructed. This fragmentation challenged old notions of selfhood inherited from hierarchical design. In place of singular identity, multiplicity emerged. A human could belong to many communities, hold conflicting values, change roles fluidly. This flexibility undermined rigid control structures. Authority struggled to adapt. Systems designed for uniform subjects faltered when faced with fluid individuals. This fluidity extended to belief. Faith became optional, modular, personal. Some returned to ancient gods. Others rejected divinity entirely. Many combined fragments, creating hybrid worldviews that reflected lived experience rather than doctrine. Humanity treated belief as tool rather than obligation. Such treatment would have been unthinkable under direct divine rule. It represented a level of autonomy incompatible with servitude. Humanity had crossed a threshold not through rebellion, but through adaptation to absence. If the gods were watching, this development would matter. It suggested that humanity no longer required constant oversight to function. It could self-regulate, self-correct, self-imagine. These capacities were not guaranteed outcomes of original design. They were emergent properties born from silence. Emergence, however, is unpredictable. It can stabilize or collapse. Humanity's systems remained fragile. Environmental strain, technological misuse, ideological extremism all threatened regression. The species walked a narrow path between maturation and self-destruction. This precarious balance defined the present. Humanity was no longer a child awaiting instruction, nor a servant awaiting orders. It was something unfinished, testing its limits without assurance of success. The gods, absent or distant, were no longer the central actors. What mattered now was not return, but readiness. Not obedience, but coherence. Humanity had to decide whether it could sustain a world without external authority, or whether it would recreate the same hierarchies indefinitely under new names. The long silence had done its work. It had stripped away certainty, forced adaptation, and exposed potential. Whether this potential would crystallize into stability or fracture into collapse remained unresolved. But one thing was clear. The world left behind by the gods no longer existed. If they returned, they would not find their creation waiting where they left it. They would find something altered by absence, shaped by error and insight, burdened with freedom. And whatever judgment followed would no longer be one-sided. It would be a reckoning between origin and outcome, between intention and evolution, between what was designed and what had learned to exist without permission. At a certain point, humanity ceased to measure itself against the past and began measuring the past against itself. The ancient stories no longer functioned solely as explanations of origin, but as artifacts, evidence of a mindset that once shaped reality. Clay tablets, ruined towers, ritual calendars, and inherited hierarchies were examined not with reverence, but with curiosity. What had once been divine instruction was now treated as data. This shift did not happen suddenly. It emerged gradually as humans developed tools capable of revealing patterns across deep time. Archaeology exposed layers of civilization stacked like sediment, each inheriting and modifying what came before. Linguistics traced how sacred names changed form while retaining function. Comparative mythology revealed the same structures repeating under different symbols. The conclusion became difficult to avoid. The gods did not simply disappear. Their system persisted. Humanity began to recognize that much of its world operated on borrowed logic. Work schedules mirrored temple routines. Legal codes echoed divine decrees. Social stratification followed ancient cosmic hierarchies, with those at the top framed as closer to truth, purity, or destiny. These patterns survived not because they were optimal, but because they were installed early and reinforced relentlessly. Understanding this inheritance created discomfort. If the systems governing daily life were not natural but designed, then they could be redesigned. This realization threatened those who benefited most from continuity. Power resisted reinterpretation. History was defended aggressively, framed as sacred rather than constructed. At the same time, technology accelerated humanity's ability to test alternatives. Communication collapsed distance. Ideas spread faster than authority could contain them. Individuals encountered perspectives beyond their inherited narratives, discovering that many rules presented as eternal were local and contingent. Comparison weakened absolutes. This weakening exposed the fragility of old justifications. Without gods to validate hierarchy, inequality required new explanations. Efficiency, security, tradition, and nature itself were invoked as substitutes. Yet each explanation cracked under scrutiny. Efficiency often served accumulation. Security justified control. Tradition masked inertia. Nature was selectively interpreted. As these cracks widened, humanity faced a paradox. The old systems were flawed, but dismantling them risked chaos. Stability had been purchased at the cost of flexibility. Removing constraints threatened collapse, but maintaining them guaranteed stagnation. There was no safe path forward. In response, humanity experimented unevenly. Some societies clung tighter to inherited structures, doubling down on authority and conformity. Others dismantled aggressively, embracing radical decentralization. Most oscillated between the two, correcting excess through crisis rather than design. Crisis became the engine of transformation. Economic collapse forced re-evaluation of value. Environmental degradation exposed the cost of unchecked extraction. Social unrest revealed the limits of enforced hierarchy. Each crisis stripped illusion from structure, revealing underlying assumptions. Through these disruptions, a pattern emerged. Systems that treated humans as resources failed catastrophically under pressure. Systems that treated humans as participants adapted more effectively. This distinction echoed the ancient origin story. Humanity functioned poorly when reduced to labor. It functioned better when granted agency. Agency, however, introduced responsibility. Without divine oversight, failure could no longer be externalized. Mistakes were not tests imposed from above, but consequences of human choice. This accountability was psychologically demanding. Many preferred the comfort of blame. Others accepted the burden. Those who accepted it began redefining meaning. Purpose was no longer assigned. It was constructed through relationship, creativity, and stewardship. This construction was fragile and imperfect, but it was owned. Meaning no longer depended on return or approval. As meaning shifted, so did identity. Humans stopped defining themselves primarily through obedience to systems and began defining themselves through contribution to shared outcomes. Community replaced hierarchy as organizing principle in some spaces. Cooperation emerged not from command, but from necessity. These developments did not erase conflict. Power continued to concentrate, Exploitation persisted, but the narrative that justified them weakened. Injustice was harder to sanctify. Resistance gained legitimacy, not as rebellion against gods, but as correction of flawed systems. This correction process was slow and non-linear. Setbacks were frequent. Yet each attempt expanded the range of what humanity believed possible. The idea that the world could be otherwise gained traction. Imagination became political. At the same time, humanity confronted the legacy of design at a deeper level. Biology itself came under examination. Traits once accepted as fixed were understood as malleable. Evolution was no longer blind. Technology offered the ability to intervene directly in the human condition. This capability revived ancient anxieties. To alter design was to challenge the act of creation itself. Humanity stood where the gods once stood, facing the temptation to optimize life according to narrow metrics. The risk of repeating the same errors was evident. Yet awareness of this risk marked progress. Unlike its creators, humanity possessed historical memory of imposed order and its consequences. It could reflect on what control had cost. This reflection introduced restraint, not universally, but increasingly. Restraint was not weakness. It was recognition of complexity. Humanity began to understand that systems too rigid to accommodate difference inevitably broke. Diversity, once treated as noise, revealed itself as resilience. Variation allowed adaptation. This understanding reframed the long silence. The absence of gods had not left humanity directionless. It had forced it to discover principles that functioned without authority: cooperation, empathy, accountability, adaptability. These were not divine gifts. They were emergent necessities. If the gods were watching, this emergence would matter. It demonstrated that humanity could sustain order without coercion, meaning without mandate. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. The original design had been exceeded not through defiance, but through growth. The silence, then, was not emptiness. It was incubation. The withdrawal created conditions under which something new could form. Humanity was no longer a static creation awaiting instruction. It was a dynamic process redefining itself. Whether this process would stabilize or collapse remained uncertain. But uncertainty itself became acceptable. Humanity learned to operate without guarantees. It built provisional systems, aware of their impermanence. This acceptance marked a quiet threshold. The gods, once central, were no longer necessary for function. They remained as memory, symbol, and question, but not as requirement. Humanity had learned to exist without permission. If a return occurred now, it would not restore an old hierarchy. It would encounter a species shaped by absence into autonomy. The reckoning would not be about obedience, but compatibility. And for the first time since the beginning, humanity would meet its origin not as servant, but as something unfinished, self-aware, and no longer waiting. The age that followed was defined less by discovery than by confrontation. Humanity no longer expanded into the unknown with innocence. Every step forward carried awareness of consequence, every invention shadowed by the memory of unintended harm. The optimism that once framed progress as inevitable had eroded. In its place emerged a heavier understanding. Advancement without integration was merely acceleration toward collapse. This awareness did not arrive through revelation. It arrived through accumulation. Data, once celebrated as neutral, revealed patterns too consistent to ignore. Systems that rewarded short-term gain produced long-term instability. Structures that concentrated power amplified error. Extraction without regeneration degraded the foundation it depended on. These were not philosophical claims, they were observable outcomes. Humanity faced a contradiction embedded deep within its inheritance. The systems it relied upon had been optimized for control and efficiency, not sustainability. They assumed oversight, correction, reset. Without those functions, the system behaved like a machine without maintenance, consuming itself to maintain output. In earlier ages, collapse had been localized. Civilizations fell while others rose. The planet absorbed damage unevenly. Now, collapse threatened to synchronize. Interdependence meant failure propagated. There was no untouched frontier to absorb excess. Humanity had become a single, closed circuit. This condition forced a reevaluation of power itself. Control, once equated with strength, revealed its limits. The more tightly a system was controlled, the more brittle it became. Shock exposed weakness. Rigidity cracked under pressure. Flexibility, once dismissed as inefficiency, proved essential. These insights challenged inherited assumptions about leadership. Command and control models faltered in complexity. Decisions made far from consequence produced cascading failure. Authority divorced from feedback generated blind spots. Humanity discovered that the problem was not lack of intelligence, but lack of listening. Listening required humility. It required acknowledging that no single perspective could grasp the whole. This acknowledgement contradicted millennia of hierarchical conditioning. The gods had ruled from above because they believed perspective flowed downward. Humanity began to learn that perspective emerged laterally. This lateral understanding reshaped organization. Networks replaced chains. Collaboration replaced command in some domains. Knowledge flowed in multiple directions. These systems were messy, inefficient by old metrics, but resilient. They adapted rather than enforced. Adaptation became the new measure of success. Survival depended less on dominance and more on responsiveness. Humanity began to value systems that could change course without collapse. This value shift was subtle, often resisted, but persistent. Resistance came from the familiar. Old structures defended themselves by invoking order, tradition, necessity. They framed adaptation as weakness. Yet each crisis undermined these claims. Systems that refused to bend broke visibly. Those that adjusted endured. Through this process, humanity confronted the deepest residue of divine inheritance, the belief that order must be imposed. This belief had justified gods, kings, empires. Letting it go felt like courting chaos. But chaos was already present, generated by rigid order applied to dynamic reality. Letting go did not mean abandoning structure. It meant redefining it. Structure became scaffolding rather than cage. Guidelines replaced decrees. Principles replaced commands. This transformation was incomplete, uneven, and fragile, but it marked a turning point. In redefining structure, humanity redefined itself. Identity shifted from role-based to relational. A person was no longer defined solely by position within hierarchy, but by interaction within networks. Contribution mattered more than rank. Influence replaced authority. This shift altered the meaning of responsibility. Responsibility was no longer obedience to rule, but care for outcome. Actions were judged by impact rather than intent. This demanded awareness beyond self-interest. It required understanding interconnectedness not as ideal, but as fact. Fact was the key. Humanity had entered an era where myth could no longer absorb failure. Consequences were immediate and measurable. Climate responded, ecosystems collapsed, social systems fractured. There was no divine buffer to absorb error. This immediacy forced honesty. Humanity could no longer pretend that destruction was abstract or distant. It lived inside its effects. The planet became mirror, reflecting behavior without interpretation. The silence of the gods had been replaced by the feedback of reality. Reality did not judge, it responded. This distinction mattered. There was no moral condemnation, only result. Humanity learned that meaning was not imposed by outcome, but extracted from response. How one adapted mattered more than what one believed. This learning deepened maturity. Maturity was not optimism or despair. It was clarity. The clarity that no rescue was coming. The clarity that no authority would absolve responsibility. The clarity that survival required conscious participation. Participation demanded presence. Humanity has to pay attention to itself, to others, to the systems it inhabited. Distraction became dangerous. Denial became lethal. Awareness became prerequisite for continuity. In this state, the ancient idea of return lost urgency. Whether the gods came back or not became secondary. Humanity could no longer wait. The work was immediate. The future was being shaped continuously by choice and neglect alike. If the gods observed now, they would see a species no longer oriented toward instruction. Humanity was not asking what it should do. It was discovering what it must do to persist. This distinction marked the final separation from servitude. Servants wait for orders. Stewards act without permission. Humanity had crossed into stewardship by necessity, not virtue. The planet demanded it. The silence enforced it. This did not guarantee success. Stewardship could still fail. But failure would be honest. It would not be hidden behind destiny or divine will. It would belong to humanity alone. In that ownership lay the final inheritance of the gods, not power, not knowledge, not authority, but a world that could no longer be blamed on anyone else. The silence had done its work. Humanity stood alone, not abandoned, but accountable, shaping the outcome of an experiment whose conclusion would no longer be written by those who began it, but by those who lived within it. In the long aftermath of abandonment, humanity discovered that memory itself was unstable. What had once been preserved as sacred narrative fragmented into competing interpretations, each shaped by fear, hope, or power. The same ancient events were remembered as mercy, betrayal, test, or punishment, depending on who told the story and who benefited from its telling. Truth did not vanish, but it scattered, embedded in symbols, rituals, and institutional habits that outlived understanding. This fragmentation created a new struggle, not between gods and humans, but between humans and their own inherited stories. The past became a resource to be mined. Selective memory justified authority. Forgotten memory fueled rebellion. History was no longer a record. It was a tool. Those who controlled its interpretation shaped the future without appearing to do so. As literacy expanded and access to information widened, this control weakened. The monopoly on interpretation fractured. Individuals encountered multiple versions of origin, purpose, and destiny, often incompatible. Certainty eroded. For many, this erosion felt like loss. For others, it felt like liberation. The silence of the gods now echoed through the noise of human voices, each claiming meaning. This noise produced anxiety. Without a single narrative to anchor identity, people grasped for coherence. Some retreated into rigid belief systems that promised clarity through exclusion. Others embraced relativism, dissolving meaning entirely. Both extremes reflected the same wound, the absence of a shared frame once imposed from above. Yet within this instability, a quieter process unfolded. Humanity began to distinguish between story and function. Myths were no longer required to be literally true to be useful. They could be evaluated by the behavior they produced. Narratives that fostered cooperation endured. Those that justified domination increasingly collapsed under scrutiny. This pragmatic approach marked a subtle maturation. Meaning was no longer sought in origin alone, but in outcome. The value of an idea lay not in its antiquity or authority, but in its capacity to sustain life within complexity. Humanity began to judge its stories the way ecosystems judge traits, by survival. Survival, however, was no longer individual. The scale of consequence had expanded beyond tribes and nations. Ecological systems responded globally. Financial systems transmitted shock instantly. Information shaped perception faster than experience. Humanity lived inside feedback loops too large to escape. These loops exposed a fundamental truth. Separation was illusion. No action remained isolated. Even withdrawal had effect. The ancient gods had once governed through distance, believing themselves apart. Humanity learned that distance was impossible. Influence permeated everything. This realization reshaped responsibility once again. Responsibility was no longer defined by intent or role, but by participation. To exist within the system was to affect it. Neutrality dissolved. Every choice carried weight, including the choice not to choose. Such weight demanded discernment. Humanity could no longer afford narratives that simplified complexity into enemies and absolutes. Binary thinking failed under interconnected conditions. Solutions that benefited one group at the expense of others rebounded unpredictably. Short-term victories produced long-term instability. From this pressure emerged a new ethic, uneven but persistent. An ethic of systems thinking. Problems were approached not as isolated failures, but as patterns emerging from structure. Change targeted incentives rather than symptoms. Prevention replaced punishment where possible. This ethic challenged deep instincts inherited from hierarchical rule. Punishment had once been the primary tool of order. Correction was imposed, not integrated. Humanity began to see that punishment without learning perpetuated cycles. Repair required understanding. Understanding required patience. Patience was difficult in a culture conditioned by urgency. Yet urgency itself had become dangerous. Speed magnified error. Slowness, once equated with weakness, revealed itself as wisdom under complexity. Through trial and collapse, humanity learned to value processes that could pause, reflect, and adjust. This learning did not erase competition or ambition, but it reframed them. Success became less about domination and more about durability. Durability shifted attention from expansion to care. Systems that endured did so because they regenerated what they consumed. Communities that survived stress invested in trust. Technologies that integrated ethics avoided backlash. These patterns repeated across scales. Repetition mattered. It suggested lawfulness, not divine, but systemic. Humanity began to recognize principles that governed complex systems regardless of belief. Balance, diversity, feedback, restraint. These principles did not demand worship. They demanded respect. Respect replaced reverence. The world was no longer sacred because it belonged to gods, but because it responded relentlessly to misuse. Sanctity emerged from consequence. This was a harder lesson than obedience, but a truer one. As respect deepened, humanity's relationship to power shifted again. Power was no longer measured solely by capacity to act, but by capacity to refrain. The ability to limit oneself became strength. This inversion challenged centuries of conditioning. Those who clung to older definitions of power resisted fiercely. They framed restraint as surrender, cooperation as weakness. Yet their systems failed repeatedly under pressure. Collapse exposed the cost of inflexibility. The lesson repeated until it could no longer be ignored. Through repetition, humanity approached a threshold. Not enlightenment, not salvation, but competence. The competence to manage complexity without resorting to mythic authority. The competence to accept uncertainty without paralysis. The competence to act responsibly without guarantee. This competence did not eliminate longing. The memory of origin still exerted pull. But longing transformed. It no longer sought return of rulers. It sought continuity of meaning. Humanity wanted assurance, not that it was watched, but that its actions mattered. They mattered because they endured, because they shaped conditions for those who followed. The gods, absent or silent, were no longer required to validate purpose. Purpose emerged from continuity across generations. In this sense, abandonment completed its work. It forced humanity to outgrow dependence. It stripped away excuses. It revealed that meaning could not be delegated. It had to be lived, negotiated, revised. If the gods were to return now, they would find a species no longer organized around fear of judgment. They would encounter a civilization shaped by consequence, not command. A world where authority had become provisional, narratives tested by outcome, and power constrained by awareness. Such a meeting would not restore an ancient order. It would confront it with irrelevance. The systems the gods left behind had been exceeded, not rejected. Humanity had learned to function without them, imperfectly but persistently. The silence that once defined abandonment now defined completion. The experiment, whatever its original intent, had produced something capable of continuing without oversight. Not flawless, not unified, but alive to its own responsibility. What followed would not depend on return or absence. It would depend on whether humanity could sustain the maturity forged in silence, resisting the temptation to replace lost gods with new absolutes, and choosing instead to live within the fragile, demanding freedom that abandonment had made unavoidable. As humanity moved deeper into the age of self-determination, it began to encounter an unexpected resistance not from external forces, but from within its own collective memory. The habits formed under divine oversight did not dissolve simply because the overseers were gone. They persisted as reflex. Even when no authority demanded submission, many continued to seek it. The longing for command survived the command itself. This longing expressed itself through cycles of regression. Whenever uncertainty intensified, societies gravitated toward simplified answers. Strong leaders emerged promising clarity, certainty, and restoration. Complexity was framed as corruption. Difference became threat. The same impulses that once justified divine hierarchy reappeared wearing human faces. The gods had withdrawn, but their psychology remained active. These regressions were not accidents. They were responses to fear. Autonomy required continuous engagement, negotiation, and accountability. It demanded effort without guarantee. For many, surrendering responsibility felt safer than carrying it. Obedience promised relief from uncertainty, even when it produced suffering. Humanity thus oscillated between freedom and control, never fully settling into either. Periods of openness were followed by contraction. Innovation triggered backlash. Progress provoked nostalgia. This oscillation created friction that shaped history as much as any technological advance. Yet with each cycle, something changed. The return to control never fully restored the old order. Memory intervened. People remembered the cost of submission. Records preserved abuses. Survivors spoke. The past no longer vanished into myth. It lingered as warning. This persistence of memory altered the trajectory of regression. Authority could no longer operate invisibly. Power had to justify itself continuously. Surveillance flowed both ways. Institutions were watched as much as they watched. The watcher had become plural. Plurality changed accountability. No single narrative could dominate indefinitely. Counter-narratives emerged, contested, evolved. Truth became less about proclamation and more about verification. This process was messy and exhausting, but it prevented total collapse into hierarchy. At the same time, humanity confronted the limits of rational control. Data alone did not produce wisdom. Analysis did not guarantee compassion. Systems optimized for efficiency often ignored meaning. People discovered that the absence of gods did not eliminate the need for depth. It merely shifted where depth had to be found. This realization revived interest in inner experience, not as obedience to doctrine, but as exploration of consciousness. Meditation, reflection, and practices aimed at awareness spread across cultures, detached from their original religious frameworks. Humans sought grounding not in authority, but in presence. Presence mattered because the pace of change accelerated relentlessly. Information arrived faster than it could be integrated. Identities fractured under constant comparison. The mind became a battlefield of signals competing for attention. Without practices to stabilize perception, autonomy became fragile. Stability, however, could no longer be imposed externally. It had to be cultivated internally. This marked a profound shift from ancient conditions. The gods had once enforced order from above. Humanity now learned to generate coherence from within. This internal coherence did not resemble obedience, it resembled alignment. Alignment between values and action, between awareness and response, between individual behavior and collective consequence. Where alignment failed, fragmentation followed quickly. Fragmentation was not merely social, it was psychological. Humans experienced increasing dissonance between inherited expectations and lived reality. Success as defined by old systems no longer delivered fulfillment. Consumption failed to resolve emptiness. Achievement did not guarantee meaning. This dissonance forced confrontation with a question once reserved for gods. What is life for? Without divine purpose, the question could not be deferred. Humanity had to answer it provisionally, repeatedly, knowing no answer would be final. Provisional answers replaced absolute truths. People experimented with meaning through service, creation, connection, and care. None of these were universal solutions, but they functioned locally, temporarily, adaptively. Meaning became something practiced rather than possessed. This practice extended to how humanity related to the planet itself. The Earth was no longer backdrop or resource alone. It became participant. Environmental feedback made clear that human systems were embedded within larger systems. Exploitation returned as instability. Care returned as resilience. This recognition reshaped ethics again. Ethics became ecological. Actions were evaluated by their impact on networks of life rather than isolated outcomes. Humanity began to understand that survival was inseparable from stewardship. Stewardship demanded humility. Humans were no longer masters of a world abandoned by gods. They were inhabitants of a system that tolerated no illusions of supremacy. The fantasy of dominion collapsed under consequence. This collapse did not eliminate ambition. It redirected it. Success became measured by sustainability. Legacy replaced conquest. These values did not dominate universally, but they gained traction where collapse had taught hard lessons. Collapse, once feared as end, revealed itself as teacher. Systems that failed exposed design flaws. Communities that endured did so by adapting. Humanity learned not to worship stability, but to design for change. Design for change required imagination. Humans began to imagine futures not defined by return to an idealized past or salvation by external force. Futures were imagined as processes, shaped by participation rather than decree. Participation became the defining challenge. Autonomy without engagement produced isolation. Engagement without awareness produced chaos. Humanity had to balance individuality with responsibility, freedom with care. This balance was not achieved once, it was maintained continuously. There was no final state of harmony waiting ahead, only ongoing adjustment. This understanding marked a departure from mythic thinking, which sought resolution through climax or return. The gods had once provided narrative closure. Their withdrawal removed it. Humanity learned to live without ending. History became open-ended, meaning unfolded rather than concluded. In this openness, fear and possibility coexisted. Humanity could still destroy itself. It could still regress into hierarchy and violence. But it could also continue learning, adapting, integrating. The silence of the gods no longer framed humanity as abandoned. It framed humanity as alone in the only sense that mattered. Alone with its choices. This aloneness was not punishment. It was condition. Condition for becoming something that no longer required oversight. Something capable of holding complexity without collapsing into control. Something unfinished, imperfect, but awake. What emerged from the silence was not certainty, but capacity. The capacity to live without guarantees. The capacity to act without permission. The capacity to carry responsibility once assigned to the heavens. This capacity defined the threshold humanity now stood upon. Whatever followed would not be determined by return or absence. It would be determined by whether humanity could sustain the balance it had learned under pressure, resisting the old reflex to surrender freedom for comfort, and choosing instead to remain present inside the demanding space that the gods, by leaving, had forced into existence. By the time humanity reached this stage, the silence left by the gods had become an active force rather than a passive absence. It pressed inward, shaping behavior through consequence instead of command. What once arrived as decree now emerged as feedback. The world responded immediately and without interpretation, reflecting choices back to those who made them. There was no intermediary to soften the response, no ritual to divert it. This immediacy altered how truth was understood. Truth was no longer something revealed. It was something demonstrated. Systems were judged by their outcomes rather than their intentions. Ideologies that promised perfection but produced harm lost credibility. Narratives that could not survive contact with reality dissolved under pressure. Humanity learned, slowly and unevenly, that coherence mattered more than conviction. A belief system that inspired loyalty but fractured ecosystems was unsustainable. A political structure that enforced order but destroyed trust weakened itself. The measure of legitimacy shifted from authority to alignment with lived consequence. Alignment required awareness across scales. Local actions produced distant effects. Distant decisions reshaped local conditions. The illusion of separation collapsed under the weight of interconnection. Humanity no longer occupied discrete domains of economy, environment, and culture. Everything overlapped. Everything fed back. This overlap demanded new forms of attention. Linear thinking proved insufficient. Cause did not lead neatly to effect. Feedback loops amplified small errors into systemic failure. Humanity began to adopt a more relational understanding of reality, recognizing patterns rather than isolating events. Pattern recognition reshaped strategy. Instead of reacting to crises individually, humans examined the structures that generated them. Why certain failures repeated. Why certain interventions backfired. Why solutions that worked in one context failed in another. The focus moved from control to understanding. Understanding required patience. It resisted the urgency inherited from hierarchical command. The gods had acted decisively, even destructively, to resolve imbalance. Humanity discovered that decisive action without comprehension often worsened conditions. Slowing down became strategic. This strategic slowness did not mean inaction. It meant deliberate movement informed by observation. Humans learned to pause before restructuring systems, to test assumptions, to incorporate diverse perspectives. Diversity of perspective emerged as necessity rather than ideal. Necessity changed how disagreement was handled. Conflict was no longer simply suppressed or defeated, it was analyzed. Differing views were treated as signals of complexity rather than threats to unity. This approach was fragile and often resisted, but it proved more resilient than enforced consensus. Resilience became the primary indicator of success. Systems were evaluated by their ability to absorb shock, adapt, and continue functioning. Fragile systems, no matter how efficient, failed under stress. Resilient systems survived even when imperfect. This understanding altered economic logic. Endless growth revealed itself as incompatible with finite systems. Extraction without regeneration led to collapse. Humanity began experimenting with models that prioritized circulation, renewal, and balance over accumulation. Balance was not static. It required continuous adjustment. Humanity learned that stability was not the absence of change, but the capacity to adapt without breaking. This principle applied to ecosystems, societies, and individuals alike. Individuals felt this shift deeply. Identity could no longer be anchored solely in role or status. Roles changed. Skills became obsolete. Stability required flexibility. Humans learned to define themselves by capacity to learn rather than position held. Learning became lifelong. Education shifted from memorization to adaptability in some regions. Critical thinking replaced obedience as core skill. This shift undermined authoritarian structures that depended on unexamined acceptance. Resistance followed. Those invested in rigid hierarchy framed adaptability as threat. They invoked nostalgia, tradition, and fear. Yet repeated failures eroded their claims. Structures that could not evolve collapsed under their own weight. Collapse was no longer viewed solely as tragedy. It became diagnostic. Failed systems revealed assumptions that no longer held. Humanity learned to extract insight from breakdown rather than deny it. This learning reduced repetition. Through this process, humanity confronted the last echo of divine authority, the belief that order must be absolute to be real. Gradually, this belief weakened. Partial order proved sufficient. Provisional solutions outperformed rigid ones. Flexibility became strength. This realization transformed governance. Instead of seeking perfect systems, humans began designing systems capable of revision. Laws included mechanisms for change. Institutions accepted feedback. Authority became conditional rather than permanent. Conditional authority altered power dynamics. Leaders were evaluated by responsiveness rather than dominance. Legitimacy depended on trust. Trust required transparency. Secrecy, once justified by divine mystery, lost credibility. Transparency exposed complexity. It revealed trade-offs, unintended effects, and uncertainty. Rather than undermining confidence, this exposure built resilience. People trusted systems that acknowledged limits more than those that claimed certainty. This shift required emotional maturity. Accepting uncertainty demanded tolerance for discomfort. Humanity learned that anxiety could not be eliminated, only managed. Attempts to eliminate it through control produced greater instability. Managing anxiety required grounding. Humans developed practices that emphasized presence, reflection, and connection. These practices were not religious in the old sense. They did not promise salvation. They offered orientation. Orientation mattered because speed had become dangerous. Technology amplified action faster than comprehension. Slowing perception became survival skill. Attention became resource. Distraction became liability. Humanity began to value depth over volume. Fewer commitments, stronger connections. Less accumulation, more care. These values did not dominate universally, but they spread where consequence made them unavoidable. As these patterns solidified, the ancient silence lost its emotional charge. It was no longer interpreted as judgment or neglect. It was understood as condition, a condition that forced development rather than dependency. The gods, if they had once believed humanity required constant oversight, had been proven wrong by absence. Not because humanity became perfect, but because it learned to adjust without command. This adjustment was messy, slow, and painful, but it was real. Humanity now inhabited a world that responded directly to its behavior. No myth mediated response. No authority softened impact. This directness forged clarity. Actions mattered because they endured. Endurance became the measure of meaning. What could persist without domination? What could regenerate without external enforcement? What could hold complexity without collapsing into control? These questions guided experimentation. Humanity did not answer them once. It answered them repeatedly, locally, provisionally. There was no final design to implement, only ongoing correction. Correction replaced obedience as central ethic. To correct was to pay attention, to admit error, to change course. This ethic demanded humility. It rejected infallibility. It favored learning. Learning under constraint defined this era. Constraint without authority, freedom without guarantee, responsibility without appeal. Humanity operated within limits that could not be negotiated with ritual or sacrifice. These limits were not enemies, they were teachers. They revealed boundaries necessary for continuity. Humanity learned to respect them not out of fear, but out of understanding. Understanding did not eliminate conflict. It contextualized it. Conflict became signal rather than failure, a sign that adjustment was needed. Suppressing conflict produced stagnation. Engaging it produced evolution. This engagement required courage. Courage not to dominate, but to listen, not to win, but to adapt. These forms of courage had not been valued under divine hierarchy. They emerged through necessity. Necessity, not virtue, drove transformation. Humanity changed because it had to. The silence left no alternative. There was no higher authority to restore balance. Balance had to be cultivated internally. This cultivation was ongoing. It demanded vigilance, cooperation, restraint. None of these were heroic in the mythic sense. They were practical. Practicality replaced prophecy. Survival replaced salvation. Continuity replaced eternity. These shifts marked a definitive departure from the age of gods. If return were possible now, it would encounter a species no longer structured around obedience or fear. Humanity would not ask for instruction. It would present its outcomes, imperfect, uneven, but earned. The silence had done its work. It had stripped away inevitability, authority, and illusion. What remained was choice, exercised within consequence. This was not an ending. It was a condition. A world in which humanity stood not beneath gods, not against them, but without them, carrying forward a reality that responded only to what was done within it, and nothing else. What remained at the end of this long passage was not resolution, but exposure. Humanity stood exposed to itself, without veil, without intermediary, without higher voice to reinterpret consequence. The structures inherited from divine order had either transformed or collapsed. What persisted did so because it responded to reality rather than resisting it. This exposure reshaped how humanity understood survival. Survival was no longer framed as victory over enemies or endurance through catastrophe alone. It became continuity through coherence. A society survived not by dominating others, but by aligning its behavior with the conditions that sustained it. Misalignment produced decay. Alignment produced resilience. Resilience was no longer accidental. It was cultivated deliberately. Humanity learned to design systems that expected failure and absorbed it without cascading collapse. Redundancy replaced singular dependence. Diversity replaced uniform optimization. These principles appeared repeatedly, validated by experience rather than belief. Experience replaced revelation as the primary source of authority. What worked was trusted. What failed was revised or discarded. This pragmatism did not eliminate ideology, but it constrained it. Ideas had to survive contact with consequence. Consequence itself became teacher. It did not negotiate or forgive. It responded. Humanity learned to read these responses carefully, treating them as information rather than punishment. The planet, the economy, and social systems all communicated limits through feedback. Ignoring these signals proved fatal. Listening became survival skill, not passive listening, but attentive interpretation. Humanity learned to distinguish noise from warning, trend from anomaly. This skill demanded humility. It required admitting that no single perspective was sufficient. Humility altered leadership permanently. Authority could no longer claim infallibility. Leaders were expected to adapt publicly, to revise decisions, to incorporate dissent. This expectation destabilized rigid power structures, but it strengthened collective capacity. Collective capacity mattered more than individual brilliance. Complex problems resisted solitary solutions. Coordination across difference became essential. Humanity learned to treat disagreement as asset when managed constructively. Constructive management required shared frameworks, not universal ideology, but common principles: transparency, accountability, adaptability. These principles did not promise harmony. They enabled correction. Correction replaced perfection as aspiration. The gods had once ruled through absolute standards. Humanity learned that absolutes shattered under complexity. Imperfect systems that could change outperformed perfect systems that could not. This realization altered how humanity related to failure. Failure was no longer a moral indictment. It was diagnostic. Systems that failed revealed design flaws. Addressing those flaws mattered more than assigning blame. Blame lost utility in an interconnected world. Assigning fault did not restore balance. Repair did. Humanity redirected energy from condemnation to reconstruction where possible. This redirection was uneven but persistent. Reconstruction extended beyond infrastructure. It reshaped culture. Stories shifted from conquest to continuity, from destiny to stewardship. Art reflected fragility rather than triumph. Education emphasized systems thinking rather than rote mastery. These shifts did not erase violence or inequality. Humanity remained capable of destruction. But the justification for destruction narrowed. Without divine sanction, harm demanded explanation. Where explanation failed, legitimacy collapsed. Legitimacy itself became provisional. It depended on trust sustained through action. Trust could not be inherited or demanded. It had to be earned repeatedly. This requirement slowed governance, but deepened stability. Stability no longer meant permanence. It meant capacity to endure change. Humanity learned to hold contradiction without collapse. Diversity of belief, identity, and practice became manageable through shared commitment to process rather than outcome. Process replaced prophecy. The future was no longer imagined as endpoint. It was understood as trajectory shaped continuously by present action. This understanding eliminated finality. There would be no final victory, no ultimate failure, only ongoing consequence. This absence of finality altered motivation. Humanity no longer acted to secure eternal reward or avoid eternal punishment. It acted to sustain conditions for continuation. This motivation was quieter, less dramatic, but more durable. Durability mattered because nothing external would intervene. The silence of the gods was not temporary. It had become permanent context. Humanity adapted accordingly. Adaptation did not require certainty about origin or destiny. It required attention to present conditions. The ancient questions about who created humanity and why lost urgency. What mattered was what humanity did now. This focus marked completion of a long transition. Humanity no longer defined itself primarily by relationship to absent gods. It defined itself by relationship to each other and to the systems it inhabited. The gods remained as memory, metaphor, and caution. They represented a phase of authority humanity had outgrown by necessity. Their withdrawal had forced development of capacities they never demonstrated: revision, restraint, and repair. Repair became the highest expression of intelligence, not building endlessly, but fixing what existed, not expanding without limit, but sustaining within bounds. These acts lacked mythic grandeur, but they preserved life. Preservation replaced salvation. Humanity accepted that nothing would be saved from outside. Continuity depended entirely on participation. This acceptance was sobering and empowering. Empowerment did not mean control. It meant responsibility without appeal. Humanity stood fully accountable to consequence, with no one else to blame or obey. In this accountability, the long narrative reached its end, not with closure, but with clarity. The gods had left. Humanity had continued. The world responded. There was no verdict from above, only result. What humanity became next would not be judged by myth or prophecy, but by whether it could sustain the fragile balance it had learned through silence. Whether it could resist recreating masters to escape responsibility. Whether it could live with freedom without turning it into domination. The silence had stripped away illusion. What remained was choice. And in that choice, repeated endlessly without guarantee, humanity finally stood not as servant, not as rebel, but as participant in a world that answered only to what was done within it, and nothing else. At the furthest edge of this transformation, humanity encountered a final responsibility it could no longer postpone. Authorship. Not authorship of myth or doctrine, but of trajectory. With no external authority to define direction, the species stood as the sole writer of its future, constrained only by consequence and continuity. This authorship was not symbolic. It manifested daily, materially, irreversibly. Authorship demanded coherence across time. Short-term survival could no longer justify long-term damage. Decisions taken for immediate comfort echoed forward, shaping conditions for generations unseen. Humanity learned that the future was not an abstract inheritance, but an active construction assembled piece by piece through present behavior. This realization altered how progress was understood. Progress was no longer accumulation of capability alone. It became refinement of alignment. Tools mattered less than how they were used. Power mattered less than restraint. Knowledge mattered less than wisdom applied under pressure. Wisdom, unlike intelligence, required integration. It demanded synthesis of experience, empathy, and foresight. Humanity began to value those who could connect domains rather than dominate them. Bridge builders replaced conquerors in importance. Translators of perspective mattered more than enforcers of certainty. This shift reshaped institutions at their core. Structures that rewarded domination lost effectiveness. Structures that rewarded collaboration stabilized. Incentives changed slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. Systems evolved not toward perfection, but toward survivability under complexity. Complexity itself became accepted reality. Humanity abandoned the fantasy of final solutions. Problems were understood as dynamic, requiring ongoing engagement rather than resolution. This acceptance reduced desperation. It allowed adjustment without despair. Despair had once driven humanity toward gods, prophets, and absolutes. In their absence, despair transformed into discipline. Discipline not of obedience, but of attention. Staying present to consequence. Responding rather than reacting. Correcting rather than defending. This discipline matured into culture. Norms emerged that favored accountability over blame, curiosity over certainty, care over conquest. These norms were not universal, but they propagated where survival demanded them. Culture evolved through selection, not decree. Selection revealed uncomfortable truths. Systems that ignored inequality destabilized themselves. Communities that fractured trust collapsed under stress. Environments stripped of resilience failed to recover. These failures were not moral lessons imposed from above. They were structural outcomes. Structural outcomes reshaped ethics decisively. Ethics ceased to be abstract ideals detached from reality. They became operational principles embedded in design. Fairness mattered because unfair systems failed. Inclusion mattered because exclusion wasted capacity. Care mattered because neglect amplified risk. Risk itself became collective. No individual or nation could isolate consequence indefinitely. Humanity discovered that insulation delayed but did not prevent impact. Shared vulnerability forced shared responsibility. This responsibility extended beyond humanity itself. Other life forms ceased to be background. Ecosystems became partners in continuity. Their degradation destabilized human systems directly. Preservation was no longer aesthetic or moral alone. It was functional. Functionality reframed value. Value shifted from extraction to regeneration, from consumption to renewal. Systems that replenished what they used endured. Systems that consumed without return collapsed predictably. Predictability replaced prophecy. Humanity learned to trust patterns more than promises. Feedback loops taught faster than belief. This learning reduced dependence on narrative authority. Narrative did not disappear. It changed function. Stories no longer explained destiny. They modeled behavior. They illustrated possibility. They transmitted values through example rather than command. Example mattered because no rule applied everywhere. Humanity learned that influence flowed through demonstration. What was practiced spread. What was imposed resisted. Cultural evolution accelerated accordingly. Acceleration itself became regulated. Humanity learned to differentiate between reversible and irreversible domains. Innovation surged where error could be corrected. Caution governed where mistakes were permanent. This discernment prevented catastrophic overreach. Overreach had defined earlier eras. Gods and empires alike had overestimated control. Humanity learned restraint through loss. This restraint was not moral superiority. It was adaptation. Adaptation marked the end of dependency. Humanity no longer waited for validation from origin stories or external judges. It validated itself through continuity. Survival became confirmation. Confirmation did not imply satisfaction. Humanity remained restless, creative, dissatisfied with stagnation. The difference lay in direction. Dissatisfaction fueled improvement rather than escape. Escape had once taken form as divine return, apocalypse, or transcendence. Those fantasies lost traction. Humanity accepted immanence. Meaning existed here in action, not elsewhere. This acceptance altered the emotional climate of existence. Fear diminished gradually, not because danger vanished, but because responsibility replaced helplessness. Control was limited, but agency existed. Agency required courage, courage to act without guarantee, courage to admit error publicly, courage to change course. These forms of courage were quieter than heroic defiance, but more sustaining. Sustaining became the ultimate measure. What could last without coercion? What could adapt without collapse? What could include difference without fragmentation? Humanity judged itself by these criteria. Judgment was internal. No cosmic tribunal waited. The silence of the gods confirmed this final condition. Humanity was alone with consequence, and that aloneness demanded maturity. Maturity did not mean unity. Humanity remained plural. Conflict persisted. Error continued. What changed was the frame. Conflict became negotiation. Error became learning. Failure became feedback. Feedback closed the loop begun at creation. Where once command flowed downward, response now flowed upward through consequence. The system completed itself. Completion did not mean end. It meant readiness. Readiness to continue without guidance. Readiness to revise without collapse. Readiness to accept limits without resentment. If the gods had intended an outcome, this would be it. Not obedience, not worship, not eternal dependency, but a species capable of sustaining itself within constraint. Whether that intention existed no longer mattered. Humanity operated as if it did not. Purpose no longer depended on origin. The silence remained. Not as threat, not as promise, as context. Within that context, humanity acted, built, repaired, failed, adjusted. The story did not close with return or judgment. It stabilized into process, a living system responding to itself. In that stabilization, humanity ceased to ask what it was made for. It focused on what it could preserve. Preservation became creation's successor. Care replaced command. Responsibility replaced reverence. Nothing descended from the sky. Nothing intervened. The world answered only to what was done within it. And humanity, finally understanding this, continued forward not in defiance of the silence, nor in hope of its end, but in acceptance of what the silence had always required: to live without masters, to act without appeal, and to shape a future that could endure without permission.